Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 113th New Social Environment. My name is Lewis, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for Rail Squares, a conversation with London MFA students, hosted by Toby Kamps. We're also thrilled to have the poet Zach Pieper here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we're on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDad, Nina Pop, David McCatty, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy-Fells, and Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host. Toby Kamps is the former director of Blaffer Museum of Art and curator of modern and contemporary art at the Menil Collection. He is now the director of external projects at White Cube Gallery, as well as being an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. Over to you, Toby.
Thanks a lot, Lewis. We are featuring tonight 17 of the 20 artists from Tomorrow London, an online exhibition at White Cube that presented graduates of fine arts master's courses from the London Colleges of Art, the Central St. Martin's, Goldsmiths, the Royal College, the Royal Academy Schools, and the Slade School of Fine Art. It ran from July 10th to August 13th, and it featured one-week exhibitions by 5 artists at a time, with a showcase bringing all of the artists together at the end. And you can access this at the White Cube website. This was a not-for-profit project. All income from sales went directly to the artists. And this was very much a celebration of art education in London during lockdown, which, as you know, hit London and many, many places very hard. It offers a platform for a diverse range of artistic voices engaged with many current and urgent cultural debates, including identity politics, decolonialization, shared and personal histories, and environmental histories too. There are also a lot of people who are doing gorgeous art for art's sakes in the exhibition. The graduates were selected by members of White Cube's curatorial team. I was a member of that. Irene Bradbury, Hannah Gruy, Susanna Hyman, Capucine Perot, and Soraya Rodriguez are my great colleagues who organized this and did such a terrific job. I want to thank all of them and my colleagues at White Cube for their great work, exposing these amazing emerging talents, and also the entire Brooklyn Rail staff, especially Louis Block and Catherine Olson and Fong Bui, for giving the Tomorrow London artists a fantastic international platform to talk about art and life in these strange times. Fong and I were talking, we decided to call this version NSE Squares, after the old corny American game show Hollywood Squares, which had a kind of Zoom format, a grid where the guests would talk around, up and down. This will be nothing like that. The dialogue will, I'm sure, be much more interesting and smart, but you get the spirit. And I've asked everyone to please try to channel their inner game show contestant in a way for kind of short, provocative answers, because we've got to move along. And so what I'm going to do is introduce groups of 4 and 5 artists from the show and give a brief introduction to their work. Will be accompany some images, and then we'll have questions for these groups, and we'll move along. And if a question that's got to be answered emerges, Lewis said we could do that by chat, and we'll try to work that in. So the first group, group 1, consists of Teresa Arede, Sholto Blissett, Victoria Cantons, and Beau Choi. And I'll start with Teresa Arede's work. She was born in 1991 in Viseu, Portugal. She lives and works in London, where she attended the Royal College of Art. She has an extensive education in music and classical voice and combines singing, stage design, and language to create sculptural and performance works recalling lucid dreams in which facts are mutable. She says that I'm interested in the idea of artificial narratives. Through researching the poetic qualities of these half-dreamt worlds, I have arrived at subjects connected to the absurd and the volatile mutability of truth. This is stage archaeology and artificial history. Sholto Blissett was born in 1996 in Salisbury here in the United Kingdom, and he lives and works in London and is a Royal College of Art graduate. He is a painter of the Anthropocene, our current geological age in which the planet's surface is largely defined by human activity, and he believes that there's been a shift in the way we see the natural world, one defined by our own subjectivity rather than an overwhelming experience of awe in nature. And he says, at first glance, my fictional landscapes evoke the Western conflicts between the human and non-human. Yet gradually, they turn us towards the sublime realization that these two notions are indivisible. Victoria Cantons was born in 1969 in London, where she lives and works, and she attended the Slade School of Art. She is a trans woman and says that that has made her keenly aware of interpersonal boundaries and power dynamics, and also an individual's need for self-definition and self-preservation. Victoria says, memories of being different suggest the need to use masks and camouflage as protection, as well as influence the paintings as they evolve in explorations of identity and self-representation. Beau Choi was born in Hong Kong, where she's calling in from now, and she attended the Slade School of Art in London. She uses performance, fiction, music, written text, and costuming to explore complex socio-political narratives, in particular the political and social dramas that have been unfolding in Hong Kong recently. Speaking in the third person, she says, often borrowing aesthetic tropes from Far Eastern folklore traditions and rituals, her use of costumes and fiction results in a world that merges the everyday with the fantastical, the mythological, and sometimes the absurd. So, group one, I would like to ask you, what made you want to study art? And maybe we can start with Teresa.
It's a bit of a difficult thing. I wanted something where I could make a mess of things every day. And I wanted to be an archaeologist or somewhere outside with a hat and discovering things. And somehow I thought that with art I could do that as well, but actually make up the things that I was finding. So it was a bit through that.
Sholto?
Sholto, you'll have to accept the...
There we go. Sorry about that. I would say the reason I started studying art came relatively recently, actually. So I did my undergraduate degree not in fine art or in painting or in art in general, but in geography. And it was mainly a fixation and interest in landscape. And I spent quite a lot of time looking at how people interact with landscape, particularly from like a Western British point of view and sort of specific landscape sensibilities. And it always drew me back to art, something that I've always been interested in for a long time. And I thought that there was actually a lot of scope for development of the themes I was seeing that sort of carried on, were quite outdated and sort of lived on past sort of the religious ideas that had sort of slowed down in a secularized or increasingly secularized society. And so that's probably the main reason I started studying, sort of going into art properly, because I thought it was the best language in order in which to sort of get across the ideas that I was trying to communicate.
And Victoria?
Hi, yeah, so drawing was something that I always did from a very early age. And as I grew up, I found that drawing ultimately was the way I could express myself, the way I could get out the confusion, the questions, the curiosity that was inside of me. Drawing, painting, making artworks over the years has consistently been a way to clear the drain pipes because, and I know this sounds incredibly corny, but it's that old adage of like, painting is breathing. Genuinely, it really is, because if I'm not able to have that outlet, then like kind of loss of therapy gone wrong, I just fall apart. It's a mental, emotional lockdown, and it was like that when I was little too. So that was the thing that took me into art. And then finally, like when I eventually got to the point where, having gone through loss of parents, having managed to get through transition without throwing myself off the top of a building, and so on, I just wanted community. So I eventually went to art school to find that.
And Beau Choi?
I think it all boils down to a strong instinctual urge, and it's the thing that consistently makes me feel fulfilled. Yeah.
I have noticed in all of your work that maybe there's a kind of almost a diorama or a stagecraft or a drama aspect where all of you four artists feel compelled to remake the world, to kind of handle it in miniature form or re-envision it in some way. Would you say that's fair? And can you say anything about that observation? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, definitely. For me, that's very much true. And for me, it's connected also with my studies in music and in opera in particular. And being on stage as well within an opera, not concert, but an opera. And those worlds and those artificial, because opera has that thing of really going in with everything, image, sound, exaggerated stuff, artificiality that works in kind of I don't know if this is the right word, but in a magical way, kind of changes you for that moment you're watching that thing. It's kind of overhuman, something like that. Yeah,
I would definitely agree that I think that's the case in my work as well. Sort of the idea of like the sort of creating worlds. I mean, all my work is done from my imagination, so it's something that it's quite important to the work, but I often forget to state is that it is everything's fictional in it. It doesn't draw on a specific place or an individual scene. And friends of mine used to joke that I paint the backgrounds to paintings. They always said that I should probably get another artist to populate my paintings with figures. But it's sort of it's the point of part of the point of the work is the absence of people in this landscape, in this sort of a landscape that is unashamedly and like admits its mediation by culture, that adds to the point of the paintings and also lends a slight eeriness that I obviously saw reflected in sort of the situation we saw in lockdown, especially in London, for example, where I live. That was totally accidental, but it was quite a strange sort of parallel between the world I was living in and the paintings that I thought were so fictional that sort of turned out to almost be lived out in some ways.
I think for me, it is really trying to make sense of the world. And so there is, I suppose, as you were saying, Toby, a degree of partly remodeling, and partly just simply modeling, full stop. Because I remember a long time ago I was having a conversation with a fellow artist, and he said, painting, it's like, you know what you're looking at, but you're trying to push through a glass door to go to it. And I said, no way, not for me. I'm a bit like the guy in archaeology who's like got his little trowel and is in the backyard scraping away at the soil. And he knows he's looking for something, but he's not entirely sure what it is until he gets there. But at the same time, it's like there's like, I left something here, I've got to find something here. And that will help me, inform me, discover who I am. It will help me make sense of the world. It's like in that find, I will find myself too. So it's yeah, there's painting from memory, there's painting from creating, there's an issue of like trying to shape the truth, trying to shape a truth that works for me. And it may not work for anyone else, but it works for me at least.
This came up in the last New Social Environment conversation with Michael Armitage, who also is somebody who is trying to do, I think the Germans call it the Weltbild, the world picture, you know, and I think it's incredibly ambitious for an artist, but incredibly admirable, because I remember thinking, like, you know, why are we here if not to figure it all out? And you four are kind of trying to bring the world into your work in a really admirable way. Do you feel that way, Beau, with your work is maybe more about a specific situation, dare I say, in Hong Kong?
Yeah. I mean, it's one specific situation as well as like a situation that's been going on for a long time. So,
can you say what that is, just for the audience?
I guess it's the failure in starting the process of decolonization, or the failure of decolonization. Yeah, so for me, I think I 100% agree with what's been said by Victoria, Sholto, and Teresa. And what I'll add is it's a way in creating worlds, in creating perhaps the fantastical or the mythological for me, is the way to deal with the situation, or deal with the world, or to kind of interpret the kind of emotions that going through the dealing of the world as well. So, yeah.
Of course, we're living in a world that is highly mediated, and often it feels like entirely screen-based. You're dealing with the real world, but what role does the digital world that we all inhabit play in your work?
I struggle with this a bit, with the digital, because being born in the early 90s, it's I was in between not having a computer, and I remember that, and there were no phones or anything, and then completely everything exploded. And related to art and to seeing images online, I struggle a lot with the attention span that is given to images, and how everything is also in the same plane, so it's all kind of leveled. And when I open a book by an artist where I see images, I stay with that object for a long time. I look at that for a long time, and that doesn't happen to me when I'm scrolling on my phone or on my computer. And then I start thinking, if this is the attention I give to things that I see online, so this is probably other people are giving the same attention to, also the content I'm adding. Yeah, so I struggle with that. I don't feel like it's is doing a lot of good to me, just this amount of stuff that we see online, and the time that we don't spend at seeing it in front of us, I think.
Oh, you use Beau Choi. Is it Beau or Choi? I'm sorry. Beau. You in your video work where you have these costume performers in Hong Kong, you've worked in cell phone footage of the protests there. Were you interested in just having the footage, or did you want that kind of headspace of, you know, holding your phone and recording some important event?
I just take videos with my phone all the time, and that just and with sensitive situations, I can't, you know, use my camera, but when I make films and when I make videos, I kind of troll through my kind of archive of materials and see what would fit. So it's sort of yeah, it's also it's a way of making the work, I suppose.
But it has a different feel when you switch to the handheld cell phone footage. Suddenly it's grainier and it's sort of jitterier, and it took me, you had a kind of narrative which was unfolding very tranquilly, and suddenly that jangly mobile phone footage was in there, and it was powerful because suddenly you're reminded that this is unfolding more or less in real time in Hong Kong. So I thought that was really powerful in the work.
Thanks.
Toby, if I can jump in, we had an audience question if you're ready to head to one of those.
Yeah, do you want to read it, Lewis? Or I can't see it. Okay.
So this was for Sholto. It comes from Nick. I'm curious how Sholto engages with contemporary writers or theorists on the Anthropocene, and how text and literature factors into his visual work.
So I would say that one of the main writers that's influenced me most recently has been Hartmann, who sort of wrote about object-oriented ontology. And so it's sort of been looking at a much, basically in gist, a much less human-centric view of the world. So the main thrust at the moment in my work, I would say, also hasn't really been so much specifically about the Anthropocene, but about the sublime and how that's viewed differently in the Anthropocene. So my work, going slightly also back to the question on technology as well and how that influences, I would say that technology provides almost sort of a friction to my work, because my work charts the movement from sort of the theorization of the idea of the sublime in sort of like Enlightenment Western culture by Burke and Kant, and the idea of touching the face of God in nature, through to sort of the site of the sublime being the industrial and sort of war machines, and now today it's the internet and genetic engineering. And so I'm sort of looking at these like new formats and sort of how they've impacted the sort of the natural world that's separate from humans, that we now know not to be the case in the post-Darwinian world and the Anthropocene, and looking back at that and seeing how we can then reapply the sublime to nature and experience it in landscape in a world that we know we're fundamentally connected to. But yeah, I'd say I also look quite a lot at the work of Jed Quinn, who's a painter that uses like a heavy reference to history sort of painting, as it were, looking at the work of Claude Lorraine. But he does so in a much more sort of, I describe it almost as playful. I know it's an overused word, but sort of adds in like sort of much more explicit props to sort of signal a conversation in his work. But I don't know if that entirely answers your question about the Anthropocene. Quite often it's sort of like a range of like academic texts that sort of aren't from specific authors, but more from studies looking at things like the extent to which we're changing the makeup of soil, the makeup of air, and the makeup of ice and water.
How English are your landscapes, Sholto?
I wouldn't say that particularly. So I draw a lot on sort of the romantic traditions of painting. So I would say anything starting really with Claude Lorraine all the way through, quite important in my work, to the Hudson River School. And so it cuts across also the idea of the problems of colonization and colonialism, and how that's been used and how that takes ownership of landscape as a process of oppression. And sort of, I range, but very rarely looking specifically at British landscapes or painting British landscapes. So it's sort of got more of an interest in like the power of like the gaze on landscape, especially sort of looking at like other worlds, as it were, I guess, like places that aren't that British in terms of the landscape. Normally they're quite dramatic. I mean, that's also part of the sublime, I guess. And it was the idea of going out and encountering something that wasn't really that ordinary. And of course, Britain's topography is generally quite flat. I mean, other than a few places in sort of Scotland and the Lake District and Wales. Yeah, so they're not particularly, they don't draw massively on British landscapes. They don't draw so much on the idyllic as they do on the sublime.
And Victoria, would you say that your work maybe is an antidote to our digital realms because it's so handmade? And
I mean, the funny thing is that, yeah, as you said in your introduction to me, I was born in '69. So the internet and the digital age didn't kick in until I was I got my first Mac when I was 27, 28 in the late 90s. Before that, even my first mobile phone was only a couple of years before that. When I was younger, I was a real bookworm, but now I'm like the kids that grow up with the computers and internet. I'm on it all the time. And I love what the internet can offer. I love the fact that as much as I have been privileged enough to travel all over the place, very privileged to being able to do that. I love that I can access the world through my phone, through my computer. And I draw on the images that I can look for through that interface. But at the same time, there's a real push-pull thing happening because, you know, I love it, but I also want to hold it at bay like a dam. You know, it's like because it can overwhelm. It's the flood, and suddenly, you know, you want it, but you don't want it. It's feeding, it's life-giving, but it overtakes, and it's distracting ultimately. And there are, of course, and I'm sure that's the case for all of us, there are the times when ultimately it's like, you know, stop the ride, I want to get off. I've had enough. I want to just get back to the important stuff. And this is like, this is like food that's too rich.
well, thanks, group one. Let's move on to group two, which consists of Alexander Dixon, Paola Estrella, Michael Forbes, Christopher Hartmann, Januario Jano. So first, there's Alexander Dixon, who was born in 1995 in Darlingscott in Warwickshire. And he lives and works there and in London, where he attended Central St. Martin's. Alex is interested in the contemporary relationship between the natural and the artificial, specifically where they collide as our natural and technological environments change and evolve. So he's using 3D printers and regular printers to make kind of natural artifacts oftentimes. And he says that the models that he's reproduced in his photographs are artificial echoes of nature. They were made during lockdown using 3D and photo printers, and they reflect both the pandemic's influence on the imagination and the restrictions it has imposed on making work. So maybe a little bit of that remaking the world thing that we just talked about. Paola Estrella was born in 1988 in Mexico City, and she lives and works there and in London. She attended the Royal College of Art here. Her immersive video, A Timeless Parallel, melds real and manipulated footage, creating a fantastical and voyeuristic vision of life in which fantastic creatures share an elegant apartment. She says, by diving into the blurred limits between the real and the public and the private, I convey how these impact and shape social conventions, gender roles, and identity, and our notion of reality itself. Michael Forbes was born in 1962 in Nottingham, here in the UK, and he lives and works in Nottingham and London. Where did you go to school, Michael? Sorry, I didn't catch that. He can tell us later. Inspired in part by seeing African immigrants selling knockoff handbags, his photographic and installation works use fashion and fantasy costuming elements to talk about what you might call the military-industrial complex of marketing, branding, advertising, and race. He says, I developed abstract text layers for the work, aligning the work to contemporary advertising and creating a genuine link to the shop windows and the racial political discourse of today. Christopher Hartmann was born in 1993 in Haßfurt, Germany, and he lives and works in London. He studied at Goldsmiths University. He works in a conventional yet uncanny realistic style reminiscent of German new objectivity painting of the 1920s, and also the filtered imagery of contemporary screen-based life, and to describe intimacy and also the alienation and detachment of male relationships. He says, my intention is to create ambivalent and ambiguous scenes of interpersonal relationships that take place in non-places and times. Alienated from their surroundings, the depicted subjects appear inward-facing, caught between hiding and exposing their vulnerability. And finally, Januario Jano. He was born in 1979 in Luanda in Angola, and he lives and works between Luanda and London and Lisbon. He attended Goldsmiths University. He's a research-based, multidisciplinary artist interested in contemporary cross-cultural facts and fictions, ecological, sociological, and physiological. He says, my work deals with personal and cultural identity to explore historical and contemporary narratives within a globalized context. The body plays a pivotal role as the main motif and leads the way to link the present and the past. So, for group 2, I would like to ask you, first of all, who is your most influential figure? Who is an extremely influential artist or art historian or any cultural producer for you? Who inspires you? And maybe we should, yeah.
Yeah, that's an extremely tough question. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily I have a specific person that influences me necessarily. I think it changes on a regular basis. I would say. I mean, if I was to say, you know, in the last few days, I'll say Bruno Munari, just because I read his book a few days ago, and so I'm sort of hooked on that for now. You know, I think I wouldn't be able to put my finger on somebody who's influenced me entirely throughout the time I've been making art. Yeah, really. So I did dodge that question.
Similar to me, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Again, I'm struggling to say one person. Kind of in terms of artists, I've looked at a range of artists over the years. I'd say from Rembrandt to Arthur Jaefers, all had some impact on my thinking. I did my dissertation looking at Kerry James Marshall's work around metaphysics and blackness, so that had some impact on recent work as well.
Well, in my case, I would say my grandmother, who's an artist. So she was the first person that I had contact with as a child, and she had this space in which there were no rules. And even though she has never been actively participating in like the art world, she has always been in constant search for new mediums and new ways of expressing herself. So I think that I always go back to her and how she works in essence to get the strength to find my own voice. So I would say that it's her. Her name is Genia Gabilondo. So
Was she a painter?
Yeah, she's a painter and also a singer and a composer. So yeah, she's still alive actually. So yeah, and I have an amazing connection with her. But I think that I admire a lot how she produces, and she's in constant seek of new things, even though she's never been inside the art world. And I think I like that and I admire that a lot.
Yes, that's me. I can, okay, answer to that question, basically, I kind of draw myself out of the art circle. I have like very heavy influence throughout my life by two women, which is my grandma. Special one who's still alive, which is Marika, that's her name. She's 102 years old and she's still kicking. Basically, this woman has been and is present still, be the source of everything I do, even my work. There is a fingerprint all over it. So the reason why I do what I do, and even the material I use in my practice, everything has kind of channeled to her. It's like she's kind of big influence in my life and still be. Even though I have like lots of other references, but she's the central point on that sense.
Christopher?
I think I wouldn't be able to name specific figures. I suppose I'm interested in, and that's something you've already mentioned, Toby, like for example, German Romanticism, or even just like photography, like fashion photography. I mean, if I had to name a few figures, I would say Wolfgang Tillmans. I love his photographs. I would probably talk about Ed Atkins in my work. And I would say as well, somebody I really enjoy reading is Maggie Nelson. She's like my favorite author. What I really like about her work is how she uses personal experiences but still makes it possible for the reader to really access it. And I suppose I would also say somebody who has influenced me is also my mother. I felt there's always been something, I don't know, like a non-verbal communication going on between her and me. And I think for me, it was always, because she was painting, she was drawing, I think she was like the first figure who kind of like showed me that I could express something through images. So I think that from an early age might probably has influenced me.
With the exception of Alex Dixon, and we'll talk about your work in a moment, all of you foreground the body in different ways. And I would say that it's a vessel for identity, but that's maybe not the first thing that it presents. And I'd love to talk about that, that connection between the body and identity in your work. Some of you talk about that explicitly in what you've written about the work, and in some places it's more submerged. And we'll get to you, Alex, later. I think it's not unrelated, but I'd love to talk about the way you use the body, or even your bodies in your work. And maybe Januario could start, because you've spoken about that directly.
Yeah, sure. In my case, using the body in the work is kind of pivotal. It's the way me trying to understand myself and the history that makes me. So the body always present. And for me, makes sense even to start with any project or work to reflect into how the body could be actually this kind of transitional agent from the fiction to reality. So I normally perform, I use my own body as a vehicle to express and to convey all those messages. But in the other way, the body, not just that, the physical body, there is an abstract body within the work itself. When I reflect into pieces I do without even presence of figurative or any sort of reference of humans, still the body there. And I think it's so important. I cannot disconnect from the body and the final result itself. So the body is important.
How about you, Paula?
I think in my case, I am concerned about the human experience, what it means to have the inner world and then the external world, but at the same time being vulnerable. So we're like in between, from what I understand. And I'm also interested in what's beyond the human experience. So for example, specifically in A Timeless Parallel, all the characters or most of the characters have no head, but human body. So it's a bit trying to understand human behavior, but also without a specific identity. And I think that also, well, yeah. So it's about the human experience, what's beyond that, the inner world, the external world, and how we can't, in a way, can't escape the barriers of the body and the way we understand ourselves in it. So I think I find that fascinating, and also how we are influenced by the context or social context where we live, and how that affects the way we understand even gender, our bodies, and how we can break that and understand things from a different perspective. So I think that, yeah, so that's how like the role of the physical body in my work, I would say, if that sort of makes sense.
Christopher?
I mean, for example, when I depict like a body, I'm really not interested in a specific body. Like, I'm not interested in like all the bodies I depict. I'm more interested in the generic. I'm really not interested in the particular. I'm more interested in the mainstream and the contemporary uniform, which then also makes reference to the contemporary imagery and contemporary narratives I'm talking about. So yeah, all my work depends on the body, because it is about relationships between the bodies. But I think in my work, the way I see my work, it's never really about one specific one. It's always about the genericness that I'm more drawn to, the mainstream, the contemporary uniform, than the universal.
You and I spoke about vulnerability. You have these generic characters, but connection or failures to connect are very much a theme in your work. Can you talk about that?
Do you mean the impossibility to connect to each other? Do you mean, or?
Yeah, your characters are sort of alone together, or
yes. I mean, I suppose in all my paintings, when there's, I suppose they're like in many of my paintings, when there's only one figure, I suppose there's a certain like a longing for the other, a longing for something, for someone. And I think that's a very romantic motif. I think in my other paintings, where there's a group of people or two people, there's a certain disconnection between the figures, which is not just visual, which is not just physical distance. It's more, what I'm interested in is the emotional, the psychological distance, the gap, the emotional gap, and the impossibility to really connect to somebody else. And so the way I see my painting is like, it's kind of like I play with contradictions. It's like they're somewhere between proximity and distance, and even though sometimes I work with the frame of the painting, even though they're very close to each other, it seems that they're very like disconnected from each other at the same time, but also from their surroundings. So yeah, they're alienated and detached, and that's what I'm interested in my work, which also kind of correlates to, yeah, to technology, the digital, the way we communicate to each other. And so yeah, these relationships are always, yeah, conditioned by the digital and the way we communicate. Yeah.
Michael Forbes?
I'd say my conversation with the body is probably guided through kind of my subject and context in terms of racial politics. So then that becomes predominantly my thinking is around the body of the black body in relation to society. And I took it for granted in terms of the work I make, but it was actually put to me as a direct question on the first year. And by the way, the answer to your question, I studied at RCA, Toby.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
And so Kate Davis was my lecturer. So she put a question, why the black body? And I just thought I just took it for granted because I'm black, I'd be working with a black body. And we left it, we kind of expanded it. That was a two-tool and it got left, but it got left with me, why the black body beyond the obvious? And then I just decided to do a mind map, and a relatively simple one in terms of drawing my map. But then, because I've got mind map software on the computer, so then I did expand on it. So then I just thought of everything related to the black body in terms of history, contemporary conversations around the black body, relationship to whiteness, and so that's where I predominantly use the black body within my conversations, and then the body in terms of the Christ body as well. And then part of that's a historical relationship in terms of the impact on religion on societies around the world. And I'm kind of using that Christ figure. It's a metaphor for part of the white body, but equally I use a black body, a gold body as well.
Is consumption our new religion? Your work seems to be about.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of that. As a nation, we're consuming, and hence the shop windows and kind of doing the work around the shop windows. And I find it all fascinating. One, I'm not a big shopper, but I do find it fascinating that as a nation, nations, we kind of this consuming and spending, of my opinion, ridiculous amounts of money on handbags, all sorts of things, really.
Yeah. And Alex, too, I would argue that your work has to do with the bodily sensorium, but it's very much a kind of headspace. You have been remaking, rocks with a 3D printer. They're absolutely artificial recreations of commonplace natural things. Can you talk about that kind of headspace and the collision of the artificial and the imaginary and the real and the experiential?
Yeah, I mean, I think, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I can. I think my work really reflects how I find myself engaging with my surroundings, I think, whether that be where I'm here outside of London or when I'm back in London, and that clash kind of, I think, was accentuated by lockdown in many ways, having to utilize the kind of more artificial materials I had available to me, I think. And that's kind of enhanced that element of my work. But I mean, yeah, I think particularly that word glitch, which you mentioned, is a sort of speaks, that is what it is, and that's kind of what it made it to be. It was sort of to exist in a landscape and sort of disrupt reality in some way, almost like, so if you came across it, you'd do like a second take and sort of it would break reality and sort of maybe make you question, is everything virtual in some way? So in that sense, it's bodily, I think. I mean, I think I have a very eclectic way of gathering things as well, and that comes through me wandering and me finding different sort of surfaces and materials and things to utilize.
Right. Well, speaking of bodies and making art and doing this, I would love to know if you could share whether you have any studio rituals. How do you clear the decks and get to work each day?
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Actually, I have lots of rituals, and some of the rituals are very kind of deep into my personal being itself. But I normally get to the studio and water my plants, and probably I have like 5-minute talks with whatever work in progress. So just kind of get the feeling and the energy from material or my surrounding.
You talk to it. You talk to it.
Yeah, I silently talk. Yeah, that's kind of my ritual in the studios.
I'd say probably, I don't think I have a great deal. I'd say I'd like to generally clean up at the end of the day. So I'm coming into a relatively clean studio in the morning. It sometimes doesn't happen because if you just work late and then I just leave it, but I prefer to do my clean up, so I am coming into a clean start and then just get on with stuff as opposed to cleaning up and then starting. So yeah. Just one thing I'd like to correct, well not correct, but just say, I do talk about consumption in my work, and like I said, the shop window.
Yeah.
But I must admit, I consume by making work, so whether it's buying fake handbags or whatever to make work, so there is
which you noted are often sold in Venice, for example, by Black people from Africa. They sell the knockoffs outside of the actual luxury boutiques. So
I bought them from those guys in Naples, Venice, and Rome.
Milan.
Yeah. Paola, how do you start making your video works every day?
Yeah, I think it depends on the stage I am at. So when I do the planning, everything is very organized and tidy. And when I already decide on an idea or a project, then it becomes like a flea market, basically. So I have costumes all over the place, miniatures. But each time I finish a stage of the project, I take everything back to its place, the place that I think it belongs to. But at this specific time during the pandemic, I've lost, like I am very focused like all the time. So I'm not like sleeping that well, eating that well. So all the routine, it's completely gone. But I think that the only thing that I keep, that I still keep, it's like a constant, I have weekly objectives that I have to cover, and I'm quite strict with that. Everything else depends on the stage I am at. So yeah.
Christopher?
Yeah, I kind of relate to Paola. Normally when I have a deadline, I normally have like a to-do list for each day. So I try to be quite organized. I also clean my studio normally at night. So the next day in the morning, it's normally quite clean. I don't really have a ritual. I suppose what I do need is a good breakfast. I hate painting when I'm hungry. So I always have something to eat. Like I need to have something to eat in my studio. Otherwise getting anxious. And yeah, and then I just, prepare my palette, my brushes, and just start painting again. Just try to be, have the right mindset to continue. I mean, it also depends at what stage. Sometimes you really just want to finish a painting because you have a deadline. Sometimes I also just sit and just look before I start painting, and yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Toby, we do have one audience question if you'd like to go to that now for this group.
Please.
Some of you have touched on this, but I think we could have a slightly longer discussion about it. James in the audience wonders, with COVID having changed humanity across the globe, how are all of the artists responding to the new normal that people are calling the future?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the presence of the body, going back to the, if it's relevant, for what is it relevant? How we sometimes need a hug, right? And reptiles don't need a hug, or how it changes if you see a painting in person. but how at the same time, a lot of our desires can be satisfied without physical interaction through the digital. So I think that I've done a lot of thinking when it comes to that. And I think that that's sort of shaping the new project that I'll be working on. I don't know what others think about that.
In my case, I tend, in a way, kind of resisting this idea of transition, because as soon as we being pushed back to our little cocoon boxes, I've been actually kind of meditate around the whole practice itself, and see the world the way we actually trying to tackle this problem. And even though we don't understand we don't have the full understanding the problem and trying to bring kind of solution to the table, we just kind of try out and error. So for me, I still like kind of wanted to just take time and reflect on the past, and probably not seeing or speculating the future, because when it comes to my work, it needs physical touching, you know, it needs space to breathe. I'm kind of spiritual in my approach with practice itself. So I draw my inspiration through my grandma. She's 102, and she born just there when the first pandemic, the Spanish pandemic was hit, and she's here, she's still there. And I was like, me trying to understand how can a person transition from, you know, one pandemic and now, which she didn't actually recollect, and now she's kind of baby again because she's 102 and she losing like a memory and everything, and she doesn't really just get the full extent what's going on. And this is really like kind of weird, and I wish I could be on that body and just go through this experience. It's very spiritual for me. So I tend not to rush into this idea of transition to a virtual or abstract world where everyone's actually kind of speculating that's what we're going to. The new normal probably will be different than the one we had before, but won't be totally virtual. I am kind of advocating for no to total virtual world. So yeah, I'm an analogic person, so.
Myself, I've actually been enjoying quite a bit of the lockdown. One, because my practice is quite diverse. I did my first degree in photography many years ago, and obviously doing sculpture now at the RCA. So I've just had loads of images to edit. So I've been editing quite a lot of images. What I would have planned to do probably at some point during the summer. So that brought that forward quite a bit. And then put a number of them in book form. So I've produced about 3 different book forms of bodies of work. And I'm just enjoying slowing down and thinking. I think we was all rushing towards a degree show, and I know that would have been gone at a manic pace. And even though the RCA platform, we have to do quite a lot of work, but I enjoyed that we didn't go into a manic pace of degree show to a degree. Obviously, RCA, one of the things about RCA, it has committed to a physical show, so there will be a show later in this year, stroke early next year. And I suppose that's when we will do the manic lead up to it.
Well, I wonder if we should move on to group 3, or did Christopher or Alex have anything they'd like to say about this?
The new normal?
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, Alex.
No, go ahead.
No, I don't know, I have a problem with the term new normal. I I'm not saying I want to ignore reality, but I mean, of course it's going to have an impact. Of course it's going to changes, but I really hope that at some point we're going to go back to some things, like the way things were. I mean, not all of them. I mean, I'm totally up for change, but I suppose me as a painter, I think there's always a certain like isolation anyway. Like I'm normally in my studio just painting. It's a very kind of lonely thing to do. Like there's a lot of isolation, even though I do meet people to take pictures, photographs, and then paint them. But yeah, I also like as a painter, I really like the physicality of the paint, and especially when you make a big painting, I'm interested in the monumentality of the figures. So I'm not a big fan of virtual shows necessarily, which is weird to say because White Cube was a virtual show. I mean, I liked it, of course, but it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Christopher, I think, on that. I mean, I think I've spent a lot of time now contemplating COVID to some degree. I think I'm raring to go and get back into, going to shows and buying the book and actually making and sort of getting back immersed physically immersed back in the community of artists in London, I think. I think I'm done with the virtual to some degree. I mean, from a distance.
Great, thank you, everybody. Let's move on to group 3. That consists of Harminder Judge, Max Limbu, Emily Moore, and Anna Parok. Harminder Judge was born in 1992 in Rotherham, and he lives and works in London and Berlin. He attended the Royal Academy schools and uses Italian fresco, Indian reverse glass painting, and also waxing techniques to create small, shaped abstract paintings that feel like artifacts from another place or even another dimension. He says, my practice has spanned performance, video, and installation, channeling Gene Simmons and Kali, Hindi mythology, sci-fi, pop culture, and identity. More recently, I've been turned to making sculptures inspired by tantric abstraction from Rajasthan, one of my all-time favorite genres there. Max Limbu, who's actually joining us from Nepal, was born in 1990 there, and he lives and works in London, where he attended Goldsmiths. He's interested in the stories buildings and archaeological fragments tell, and he uses video and installation to talk about the technology of ancient temple locks and the lives of Nepalese street vendors in the time of coronavirus. He says, my work focuses on the colonial expropriation of artifacts to the changes of architectural landscapes entangled with its muted histories. Emily Moore was born in 1983 in London, and she currently lives and works here, and she attended the Royal College of Art. She investigates what she calls wildness in contemporary painting, an idea that visual language can be an extension of ideas, philosophies, lived experiences, and social systems that cross-pollinate each other. Her studio is for her an untamed landscape. She says, for me, the studio often holds the idea of potential without a clear and fixed articulation of it. There is an idea and a residue of process that gives form to the possibility of an object, place, or structure, but has the feeling of aliveness or wildness. And Anna Parok was born in 1985 in the Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union, and she lives and works in London, where she attended Goldsmiths. Her primary media are wearable sculptures and performance. Using a textile technique called tufting, she makes costumes for performances and sculptures exploring domestic spheres, heritage, and gender. She says, informed by the dynamic between personal and cultural myths, I explore how our private narratives are deeply rooted in ancient storytelling, and conversely, how folklore has the ability to tell us an intimate, confidential story about ourselves. Okay, so I'd like to ask this group, first of all, where do you draw inspiration and motivation? From where do you draw that on an everyday basis? Maybe we can start with Harminder. You've named some of your sources, Kali and Gene Simmons. And
Yeah, so I'm going to make one correction.
Please, thank you.
Born in 92. I wish that would make me like 27. I was born in 82.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go with it if that's the story you want to put forward. So I was born in 92. It was a wild time. But no, my inspiration, so, you know, it depends. I've had like a few different careers as an artist. Like I've made different types of work over maybe 10, 15 years. So I graduated back in 2005, but the work that I'm showing with the Tomorrow London stuff is my most recent body of work. So that body of work is, you know, like you said, it references a particular history of Indian abstraction, which blew my mind when I first discovered it, right? Because it looks like Western modernist geometric abstraction. So it's like, you know, small paintings, gouache on paper, that's normally really simple but beautiful. And, you know, the thing that blew my mind about those was that they're not really made by artists, right? They're made by tantric practitioners. So they're not really artworks. They're more diagrammatic or like schematic even, right? So they're made by a tantric practitioner so that they have something to put on the wall to look at while they meditate. So for me, that's more about, they're more portals than they are paintings, right? They're made so that you have something to look at or look through rather than look at, to connect yourself to the rest of the universe. And that's crazy powerful, because that, you know, that's like, and it's a contemporary thing that a lot of artists are rediscovering. Like they're rediscovering these, like, there's like a neo-spiritualism happening in art at the moment, where people are talking about the soul and love and human and connection, and all that stuff just is mind-blowing to me. And it can do amazing things for your sense of humanity, for your sense of self, if you can connect yourself to everything, and that's what those tantric painters do. And that's, I hope, somehow trickles into what I'm doing.
Max, where do you get inspiration every day? And what time is it in Nepal right now?
I don't know, maybe about 12.
And
yeah.
you are having a very severe lockdown there now, and you really had to struggle to get to a place with internet.
Yeah.
So thank you for making that effort. We really appreciate it. It's great to see you.
Yeah, I managed to break my laptop, so I'm using my phone to talk to you guys. Well, inspiration, I don't know, I think I would agree with what Harminder was saying earlier, with in the same context of what the works I've applied for the White Cube. I was looking, well, it's been last 5 or 6 years after the earthquake in Nepal, 2015. I've been visiting Nepal and looking at the effect of the earthquake, but also the idea of change, and this idea of artifacts being like souvenirs and out in the street, and also the architecture, how the idea of development is changing the whole nation, the idea of road connection. And yeah, so I guess it's what I make is usually the reflection of what I witness or experience. And it's either through movements, this interventive movements, a protest that's led by communities against these events, are just looking at history through objects that lay in the like vendors' table, desk. But yeah, it's just picking things.
Emily, how do you get ready to get wild in the studio? I'm trying to unmute you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, like that question for me just kind of sums up my approach to the studio and just my thinking around the term wildness in contemporary painting, or wildness in contemporary art, full stop. I mean, when you think about, there were some conversations that some of like my peers, like Teresa was saying earlier on, and this idea of language and this like multifaceted like experience that we're all having through like Zoom and being able to connect from different, you know, points of history and time and positions in the world. I think the way that I draw inspiration, or the way that the inspiration is just thrown at me is, you know, it's everywhere, it's everything. I mean, when you look at the way that I approach my studio and the way in which I work, like through materials and ideas and kind of, yeah, just understanding and language and history, there is this sense of just picking and just mashup of just like different feelings and experiences, both my lived experiences but then also my peers' experiences. I think, yeah, just the way that I think about, you know, my studio practice is it's just so multifaceted. It's just so much. There's so much going on. I mean, my studio is, yeah.
I have to ask you, do you have a studio ritual to get yourself into this wild place?
No, I think for me, like, I'm always reading, I'm always listening to podcasts. I'm always having like these internal, external conversations. So it's just, you know, everything kind of inspires the way that I approach my studio. So there is no ritual. I don't know, maybe that is my ritual. Maybe just everything that's going on that comes into, I think it does, obviously it comes into my studio, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a ritual as such, yeah. But yeah, wildness.
Yeah. Anna, I wonder, you know, seems to me that some of your work is about recollection. We're thinking about your childhood. Would you say that's a big source of inspiration, or are you drawing inspiration from other sources these days?
I think it's definitely, can you hear me? Is it all well? Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a starting point for me. But I think the more my practice developed, the more it became kind of, it integrates other people's experiences as well, or I hope it does. So I started, I'm very much inspired by fairy tales, by folk tales. I also have a diploma in psychotherapy, so I'm kind of taking a lot from kind of psychoanalytic thinking and thinking about how kind of personal experiences shape us, and also how culture shapes us, and those kind of transitions between the internal and the external. And I think, yeah, archetypes, and especially archetypes that has any specific relations to femininity, to ideas about, you know, what women represent or how are they being looked at. Those kind of things quite inform my practice, I guess.
Great. Your Emily, your place is wildness, but all the other artists really are in a way talking about places, former places, places where they live now. How does a place, a culture, and an experience of it flow into your work, would you say? Or how do you like to carry that along in your work, a place, a specific place, whether it's Nepal or the Ukraine, or Hindi, Rajasthan, tantric, maybe a place in that does not a physical place, but a place in art. Can you say something about that?
Are you asking me?
Anybody, yeah, but if you could start, how you're evoking a sort of another place, another time, and how maybe
I think for me this is kind of, oh sorry, this so for me I think that we're going kind of in, this is related to perhaps the former kind of the whole conversation about the new normal and the pandemic and everything that's been happening in the world now. I think we're going through a big transition. So in a way, it makes sense to look back as well. And I think that's why those themes become kind of more relevant now, because it feels like the future is quite uncertain. So you kind of want to look back to understand how you can move forward.
The New York Times said that everybody's kind of reminiscing about happier times because there's a sort of like, this happens to humans, apparently. There's a kind of stark divide between before and after. Like we tend to look back at earlier memories of earlier times.
I think it's even more further back. I think we're, well, at least for me, but a lot of people I see around me, or a lot of the artistic community I see around me, people are kind of looking into, you know, rituals and into kind of ancient cultures and unpicking their own roots. And I think there is kind of a desire to understand something very kind of I don't know, something very early to understand how we can go on, because it seems like things kind of went into this spiral, and in order to be able to continue to any sort of future, we need to understand where we stand, I guess. So I think that's, for me, that's how the whole conversation about looking back and place is kind of relevant now.
I think
Harminder,
about the idea of Renaissance and sorry.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, this idea about Renaissance of time and self, and this kind of exploration that most of us, or a lot of us, especially from in the artist community, have gone along, or have been going through during the COVID period. And you know, when you think about a place, a time, there is, you know, wherever we find ourselves. I mean, we're all on Zoom, but which it stands within a time, but then we're all in our different positions, whether that's London, you know, America, or wherever we are. So when I think about place and time, I think it definitely does reflect on this kind of this internal, like what Anna was saying about this internal exploration. And I think when I think about this idea of my term, like wildness, and this external exploration doesn't necessarily come from just self as an individual, but it does also come from like nature, and this idea of us being connected to the source, which is Mother Nature. And through that kind of exploration, then we start to like reveal or go back to where we were, like this exploration of this untamed landscape, and, you know, finding our way through these kind of fields of the unknown.
Emily, is there a place on Earth anywhere that for you kind of embodies, captures what you're trying to capture in your painting?
In my work, I mean,
is there a landscape, a club, a country, or someplace that is the wildest, you know, that sort of that you feel captures what you're trying to do in your painting wildness? Just occurred to me.
I think for me, you know, it's an internal space versus external. I've also had a chance to explore and travel the world, and I've been to lots of different places all over the globe. So there isn't one particular space that I would say definitely like encapsulates this term wildness. But I think the only language that I can like express to you would be that the multitude of the different spaces, like from north, you know, to south. You know, this idea of like, you know, traveling through the rainforest to like lounging in the beach, you know, the sand going through your toes, to living in like London, the urban environment. All of these spaces encapsulate this space, this multitude of different languages. And I feel like that's where I'm at in terms of wildness. It's not necessarily just I can't, yeah, there isn't a place or that I could take you to. If I find a place, I'll invite you all.
Please do. I could use a change of scenery. I'm sure we all could. Max, you know, Kathmandu is almost the you know, the ultimate exotic place. And how do you avoid exoticizing Nepal, this place that to us seems quite distant? How do you avoid that trap in your work?
Well, I left Nepal when I was, what, 15? And I don't know, and I returned back after like 10 years. So in my head, Nepal has always been this this idea of reminiscing my childhood. So instead, well, though I get asked every day, like, oh, Nepal is a Mount Everest and all this idea of like, Yeti and all these mythical creatures. But then to me, it's, I never left my hometown where I am at the moment, which was very, much more like a village before. So in my head, I always thought about this place. So my interaction with Kathmandu was after earthquake. So I never get the chance to exoticize the place because I saw the whole city in shambles. And I think this idea of this reminiscing, this idea of romanticizing your past, it all started to crack down. And then I guess I think it was quite good. Good point in my life as well to look into the actual issue behind the idea of what the Western world thinks of Nepal is this idea of like mountains and hiking and all these touristy places. It is, that's the whole reason why this country is still in a lockdown. And the whole conversation we are talking about is normal, and I don't know, because it's until this day everything is pretty much the same. The police are beating up pedestrians, shops are closed, and as I mentioned in one of my video, vendors, the villagers and the local vendors are being looted by the local municipality. This happened yesterday as well. So I don't know. I cannot look into this idea of this whole this Western gaze of Nepal, this idea of what the world looks Nepal as.
Harminder, is there a place in your paintings?
Yeah, I think so, but it's not geographical. It's not, like, for me, I'm looking to art at the moment during like this worldwide mess that we're in to find a sense of shared humanity, right? Like I love the fact that for me, I can look at art to connect to somebody who's anywhere in the world. So for me, if there's a place in my work, then I want it to be a place that is somehow universal. Like, and I, you know, and I think like that is what a lot of artists are rediscovering. Like maybe that's why people are turning to mythology or archetypes or any of these like big ideas, like or you know, a lot of people are talking about the micro to the macro. Like all of this stuff is basically a way of artists connecting to artists again. And by artists connecting to artists, it's actually humans connecting to humans. And that for me is like like I've rediscovered the power of art in that, you know, and like, wow, like that's incredible, right? That's phenomenal. So if I have a place, then I want it to be universal. That's why I have this idea of like, I would like to make objects that I can put in front of anybody and they would have an emotional reaction to it. I don't want to like make work that's didactic. I don't want to like make work that's about a specific thing. I want to use it to connect, and therein lies the power for me.
I think a lot of your peers in the show feel the same way. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the fourth and final group. This is Lydia Pettit, Peter Spanjer, Tseng, and Olga Ulmann. let's see. So Lydia Pettit was born in 1991 in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States, and she lives and works in London, where she attended the Royal College of Art. She paints her own body in large expressive canvases and also makes embroidered quilts that exist between painting and textile sculpture. Complex bodily memories and responses to trauma are persistent themes. She says that her works are confrontational depictions of her own inward gaze, forcing the viewer to reckon with the realities of her body and mind and their own viewpoints on the struggles women face with sexual abuse, trauma, body politics, and mental health. Peter Spanjer was born in 1994 in Bremen, Germany, and lives and works in London, where he attended the Royal College of Art. He makes video works and paintings that externalize experiences and emotions associated with his sexual and racial identity, illuminating his own emotions and subjectivity. Peter says, my work has always had a layer of sensuality, sexuality, and a certain softness and vulnerability, which can be traced to my personal battles with breaking away from gender identification within an African household, specifically as a Black gay male. Tseng was born in 1995 in Taipei in Taiwan, where he is now, and he lives and works there, and in London, where he attended with the Royal College of Art. The patterns, textures, and rhythms of the natural world are his primary inspirations, and he attempts to evoke and illuminate the ways we perceive these evanescent forces. It says, in my photographs and installations, I combine artificial and natural materials to evoke sense memories of nature, light, shadow, wind, water, the gaps between leaves. I'm trying to evoke the infinite in the bounded spaces of my work. Olga Ullmann was born in 1983 in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan in the former Soviet Union, and she lives and works in London and Frankfurt, Germany. She attended Goldsmiths University. Calling herself a practice-oriented researcher, Ullmann attempts to translate the world and her experiences of it into drawings, sculptures, installations, and moving images. Her own identity, shaped by her gender and place of origin, shapes this interpretation of life into abstract imagery. She says, my own body is the starting point of my artistic approach, where my practice derives from biographical roots, including my upbringing in the former USSR, alongside investigations into the historical framing of femininity. So I want to start by asking group 4, do you have an ideal viewer? For whom do you make your work? Who do you think about when you get into the studio and start doing what you're doing?
I'm happy to start.
Please.
Yeah.
Please, Lydia, thanks.
So I do really make my work like for myself, because I mean, it's quite literally like everything. It's all self-portraiture. It's all like about processing trauma, using the studio as sort of a therapeutic space. But I do think there's like kind of your intention, what you bring into the space, and then there's how it's received. So my intention is to do this for myself, but you have to go in with the mind of like who's going to be seeing it and how people are going to be reacting to it. So I mean, I think everyone should engage. I don't think that there's anyone my work isn't for, but I do think a lot of people who respond to my work are people who definitely people who have like issues with body dysmorphia and shame, people who've been through trauma, people who have PTSD, people who have like the specific things that I'm talking about in my work. But I do think even though I'm talking about very specific incidents and experiences in my life, they're still universal. So I'd hope that my work is accessible to everybody.
It's certainly not just raw self-expression. It's very much modulated, reframed. It's going out into the world to connect with somebody else. That is clear. Mm-hmm. Peter, who would you say who do you make your work for? Do you have somebody in mind, or is it just to?
Well, when I first started making art, that that was kind of a big question that I had for myself. Because I started making art, I would say like 3 years ago, really taking it seriously. So I kind of, when I was born in Germany and I went to like an all-white school, so I was like the only Black kid in the school. So that kind of, I feel like, had a bit of an effect when I was starting to figure out where I wanted to place my art and who it was for. So it kind of left me in a state where I started making things for certain audiences. And then by the end, I was like, none of it's actually working. So I kind of got rid of that question in a sense when I made work. Well, now I make work for myself. So that's what I would say. I think now I just really try not to think about who will see it, but rather how I see it, because I'm sure that someone else will connect in some kind of way, whether it be, you know, in terms of issues with sexuality or, you know, identity or, you know, sensitivity. I think there's something there for everyone.
How about you, Sean? You're sort of, in a way, you're capturing the universe in your work, but who do you make it for?
Yeah, this is really a big question for me, and I'm still thinking about it a lot. But in general, I think while I'm making my work, I really do not think of any specific group or specific people that I'm making for. However, as I'm mainly working with installation and photography, which reconsiders the natural space with subtle elements, like sometimes I put the sound of water dripping down, the reflection from a small mirror, etc. I do really appreciate if the viewers are willing to spending some time walking around my work, simply just slow down a bit, calm a bit, and enjoy the subtle sense of harmony and rhythm. And I do really hope my work is accessible to everybody.
Do you feel that audiences in Taiwan, where you are now, are differently predisposed to the work than audiences in, say, for instance, London? Do you feel like you get a different response in these two different places?
Definitely. I think there are a huge contrast between the responses I get from London and from Taiwan. As these two countries, we have different contexts, we have different background toward nature. As my personal experience, I feel the Western culture is more critical in terms of nature. However, on the other side, in the instant philosophy, we highlight the harmony, the quiet, the connection between the subject and the object. So when I show my work in London, we tend to discuss how we can engage, how we can face nature, how is nature nowadays. But when I show my work back in Taiwan, I receive more feedback in terms of aesthetics. We don't really talk about like the contemporary nature, I would say.
Sorry, the what? The content?
The contemporary nature, or, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Olga?
Yes.
Who do you have in mind as your audience?
I don't think I have an ideal viewer, so everybody is welcome. I also think that a piece unfolds itself fully in the eye of the recipient. So all I can offer is just my insights on how I see the world, and yeah, that I can't say otherwise but through visual art. And I think I agree with my fellow artists here that we kind of make it for everybody and for ourselves at the same time. And even if well, for me, even if nobody wants to watch it, I will still make it.
I'd like to hear from you, about all of you, about a standout moment in art school, something that changed something for you, got you thinking in a different way. and sent you on a different trajectory. Can you think of something that was a kind of important turning point or highlight in your graduate programs? Maybe start with Olga, please.
Graduate school is intensive, but also very valuable. I feel like it's a time where time is compressed and you work a lot, you experiment a lot, you try a lot, you process a lot, you learn about yourself to overcome your obstacles and boundaries. You kind of refine your own voice. It's also about self-acceptance and accepting your own art. I think the tricky part about art is that, or fine art, it's not something you can study for. So you kind of just about yourself, and you are surrounded with like-minded people. So you're always exchanging, yeah.
How about you, Sean?
I would say, actually, I'm not coming from a fine art background. I did my communication studies in my BA. So I would say during these 2 years studying at the RCA, it was quite challenging, but rewarding. My tutors are very supportive and also very critical. We always had nice discussions, which helped develop my practice very much. I like our shared studio and sculpture program too. We can always have some chat with studio mates, discuss and share our ideas to each other. And I think, I won't say there's a specific turning point during these 2 years. I just feel like the connection and the internet interaction between studio mates and the tutors are very crucial. And I feel I'm just very lucky, and because I did have a really great experience study in a graduate school.
Peter, you said you haven't been making art all that long, something like 3 years. So what were you doing before? And I imagine it was a pretty fast ramp up to suddenly be in graduate school making art. Can you talk about that shift?
Yeah, I mean, I was working, well, I studied fashion before. So that's still quite fast paced, nice, and I still kind of, I guess some of the aesthetical kind of, the aesthetic of my work, I can kind of relate back to that. But the shift felt actually really natural. I think for me, when I made, there's a piece that's actually in the show called Water, Blood and Bones. That was the piece where I was just like, okay, this is how this works. This is how I work, right? Like that just made everything make sense for me. Even in terms of, you know, filming and the devices that I use to film, like my phone and my laptop, and you know, even writing, that was the first piece I really sat down and I like wrote something and made images and put things together. So that piece for me was, I think, the turning point where I was really actually confident in what I was doing. And it's really interesting how I feel like every piece I made after that connects to the piece before, if that makes sense. So I think the next 10 pieces, once you kind of see it all in a line, I think it would, well, I hope it would make sense. But no, it was interesting to go from one fast-paced kind of industry to a place where you can take your time and you can really like explore, which I've really done for the past 2 years. But I think that was a piece of work that's really cemented my like place at RCA and the art world, I guess.
Thanks. Lydia, you went to art school in Maryland, actually, with Lewis Block, who's our MC. So you have an undergraduate degree in art, and now you've gone to graduate school. Can you talk about an important experience in graduate school, and also maybe about the difference between graduate school in the UK and undergraduate school in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been in art school because there's an art magnet in Towson, Maryland, right near Baltimore, called Carver Center for Arts and Technology. So it's a public school, but you have to audition to get in, and you get to focus on a particular discipline. So I've been like painting since I was 15. Then I went to MICA, Baltimore. Then I ran a gallery for 3 years, didn't make anything. And then I was like drifted back to art and had like a totally different approach, and went to RCA. I mean, for me, if we're kind of still on that question of like seismic moments in our graduate experience, mine was my dissertation, which we have to write one in our first year, and I was initially really scared because I'm not really good at reading or writing. Like I can do both, but it's like very intimidating to me. And I was diagnosed with dyspraxia. I didn't even know what that was when I got here because the school paid for the tests.
What is it?
It's basically, it's like a coordination and organization disorder. So people who are really extremely dyspraxic are like really like clumsy, like falling like all over the place, and they can't keep things like in their head basically. But for me, it's more like retaining information when I'm reading. I am quite clumsy, can't ride a bike, like stuff like that. But the dissertation, I ended up having such a wonderful time making it because I was able to marry these two things that I really love, which is like art and my practice, and horror and the uncanny. And I basically wrote a really campy haunted house story about how living with PTSD is like being a haunted house. And I talked about how like flashbacks are like ghosts, and there's time travels, all this crazy stuff. But I had a really fun time using the medium of writing to also work visually. Like some of my pages, you can see there's like overlapping of different narratives in these different shapes. And like, it's definitely more of like a creative writing standpoint than like maybe most dissertations. And luckily RCA gave us that freedom. But that was just a big turning point because I was using something that wasn't painting. And that was the first time I'd really done that in a long time, to talk about these issues. And I got to marry those two passions. And that really revealed itself in the second year when I hit this massive artist block with painting, and I started making textile work, which I'd never done before, and taught myself how to embroider and quilt. And this new medium that I had no history with really gave me permission to be a bit more fantastical and like imaginative with the imagery, and marry the sort of skill of like representation within the embroidery, but also the sort of unreal, like imaginative spaces that you can achieve with like the line work and the sculpting of the quilt. So that was cool. In terms of the education, I mean, compared to US schools, like this is completely independent. Like, and that's what I really wanted for my graduate school. I wanted to continue the practice that I had created back home, but with the critical feedback and a bit of structure, and just to meet people. But yeah, my BA was really structured. It was classes every day or every other day. And yeah. Is that good?
Great. Yeah, you artists, this group of artists too, are very much about the, again, a word I've used a number of times, about the sensorium. You know, Olga has these works that you have to kind of feel with your mind, and you do too, Lydia. And Sean, your work is so much about kind of being in nature and being open to all that's going on, almost in like a John Cage 4 minutes, 33 seconds kind of way. And Peter too, you know, kind of feeling your way. I like it that you have videos that are about your body, but then you have these very beautiful abstract paintings. And I guess I'll start with you, Peter, but do these abstract paintings have a source in the real world?
So they're actually not paintings. They're actually, so, I mean, the story with that particular, where that prints, they actually started out as videos. And there's one thing that I really want to do more than anything, which is paint, but I can't. I've tried, and it's not great at all. So I kind of wanted to find a way where I could make a painting without, like a digital painting, basically. And with my medium being predominantly video, I made a video which was basically a compilation of adult movies that I kind of put together, and I kind of had like an hour's worth of Black adult movies. And I really wanted to then, you know, inject like color and make them actually look really colorful. And I was thinking, you know, I want someone to hang it up at their home, you know, and it's a like 70 by 100 size print. So I really wanted you to look at something that's really, I mean, you know, something that is beautiful, but has so much of a different layer underneath it and how it started. So yeah, that's the story with the prints.
Olga, your work is, you know, you've got these abstract sewn things, you've got found elements, and I wonder, you know, what advice would you give to somebody like a really smart 15 or 14-year-old who was going into an art gallery for the first time and encountered your work? What would you say to that person? Because they're not something, they don't reveal themselves instantly.
Well, firstly, I would say good job to go to a gallery when you're 15 and to be open to contemporary art. And I think I would just tell them to let it happen, just like interact with sculptures, with the objects they find. Just look at it, look at the shape, at the size, at the texture, just the distance, look at from all it, just like kind of feel it in your body, in your brain, in your soul. Just let it happen, experience the presence of it, and I don't know, touch it. Just fulfill your haptic desire and just touch it, because I do it sometimes.
You can touch your work. A visitor can touch it.
They can touch it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not all of it, and only if they wash their hands.
Sean, what would you say to a novice gallery visitor and seeing your work for the first time?
Actually, I really agree with what Olga just said. I think if this is a children or like a 15 years old teenager, I would say, first of all, what you see in my artwork, what is the height of the artwork, what color is it, what shape do you see? And as there are some image in my work, so what can you see through this image? You just experience, you just see, and perhaps you just perceive what you can experience.
And Lydia, I'd like to ask the same question to you, but in this case, what would you say to a really smart, sensitive, open 15-year-old boy going in to see your work?
A boy. Well, I think that I've actually have had like encounters with younger people seeing my work and them not really understanding why I would paint myself like this. And what I would say is it's really just about making a good relationship with myself. And I would encourage him to do the same, because I think that we're all sort of conditioned to forever, in a futile way, be like improving our bodies or like coming closer to that center line of acceptability that many of us will never reach. And it creates a lot of discord in our mental health and our relationships with people. And I think, you know, shame is like a big tool used by media and, you know, all sorts of people to make you feel like, and you know, in really unhealthy relationships as well. And I think what I would ask him is to approach other people with the same sensitivity that he would want, I guess, himself. Yeah.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Well, wow, this has been fantastic. I just want to say thank you to everybody for your time.
We do have
and,
one audience question for this group, if that's okay, Toby.
Please, yeah.
So we have one more question from Nick. There's an interesting interdisciplinary background to all of these artists. How important is that cross-pollination to the creative process in general? Or any thoughts or comments on this?
Yeah. I'll go again, sorry. Running a gallery was like hugely integral to the way I approach work in my own work, because, you know, I started the gallery when I was 22 and didn't know shit. And I had to kind of like mature really quickly, because to curate exhibitions of people's work, you're presenting a context in which they're to be viewed. So you're responsible for the way that, in many ways, you have a duty of care to the work and to the artists that you work with. So there's a lot of responsibility for a young person to take on. So I definitely had to learn quickly about how to navigate that responsibility and how to best approach exhibitions, best approach working with people, especially people who are not represented as often in the art world, and like make sure that their voice was front and center. And I think, to me, one big thing that I learned when I was doing studios and stuff, I was just so moved by people who cared so much about their work. Like, even if it was something like, I have a friend who makes these neon sculptures that are inspired by like Star Wars and shit, but it's like, she loves them, so she loves them, and she cares about source material. And it's like, just making honest work, like making work about things that you really care about and not worrying too much about what other people think about it. Just, it all comes through in the final product. And so I try to think about, you know, having been on the other side of being of the relationship of an artist and organizer, I have to think about that in the studio as well, in terms of like, don't bullshit people, don't like pretend you know what you're talking about. Like, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be smart, like, you know, smart in a traditional sense. You know what I mean? I think that, you know, sometimes I'm like real casual when I talk about my work, but that's just that's the mindset I'm making it in. And I think that if you're just honest in making the work and in talking about it, it just comes across as more powerful, more endearing, and it makes the work just that much more compelling.
Emily, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, that word cross-pollination, I just think that it just speaks like to Tomorrow London itself, like this whole exhibition, and just like the ideas that we're all bringing forward. You know, this, I mean, when you think about like 50 years ago, like this group of artists wouldn't be showing together, like in a space, like, I know maybe White Cube didn't exist then, but, you know, and I think that is so exciting about this time, like for contemporary art, like we can all come, all of our voices can equally be heard. And it just kind of just gives me this kind of just, I don't know, this life, this energy that I just really, you know, I hope we all stay in contact and we just keep on going and pushing forward. Yeah.
We have to meet, all of us, some point here. It's ridiculous that we're so close yet so far.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Before we go to the poem, let's go quickly to our publisher, Fong Bui, for a few comments. You should be able to activate your mic, Fong.
Hey, you guys. Hello. Welcome from Greenpoint, Brooklyn. I taught this on and off more than 20 years plus, and I never seen and experienced such beautiful two things that I just experience now. It seemed to cry out, you know, at the moment, why we're going through this very profound, strange time together. One was that last week I was talking to Max Hollein, you know, the versatile director of the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. about the idea of diversity versus globalization, which somehow reminded me the same thing that we felt about democracy versus melting pot. You know, the globalization is like melting pot. It never quite allow each of us to have our own distinctive cultural heritage or certain cultural identity, distinctiveness of even our own individuality, where diversity, as it in democracy, is very fragile, but it allows for certain kind of symphonic whole totality in which each of you guys appear right in front now, like I'm looking at the grid. It humanizes everybody. Everyone is an instrument, very unique sound, and that's to be kept. You know, what we can share is together as a symphony. And I think that's why it's so important. Secondly, I never heard, and you know, each of the description of your work is so poetic and so succinct. And it's not an easy thing to do. You have to know how to do it in a haiku manner and without make it banal and obvious what you do. I enjoy very much OU, and it reminded me very much when I started out. It's very exciting, and what you are reflecting now is very much indicative to what we're going through now. So I'm grateful that you all can come and talk about your work as honestly, as generously as you can. And thank you, Toby, also for hosting it. And so I wish you luck and be courageous and be in touch with one another, because it is a community after all. And I hope that we'll get to meet you either here or Great Britain, New York, London, or elsewhere, okay? Thank you very much. Congratulations, you all.
Thanks, Fawn.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Toby, for hosting and for asking those wonderful questions. Thank you to everyone in the audience that asked their questions. At The Real, we have a tradition of ending our lunchtimes with poems, and we've carried that tradition into these community events. So today we're thrilled to welcome the poet Zach Pieper to the stage. Zach Pieper's work spans poetry, sound, song, radio art, and performance. He creates large mosaics of small ghosts drawn on hundreds of Post-it notes in shopfront windows and other spaces. Same Here, selections from a decade of poems, was recently released from Adjunct Press. Zach, you should be able to activate your mic now. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Louis. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you. It's a tremendous pleasure and a distinct privilege to be around such a diversity of work, and I'm very inspired seeing all this work. And so it's been really a wonderful experience. And to end with some poems for you all. This is just a sequence of some short poems that I'll read. This one, this is called, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. This is called Hun. Hun? Honey? I think I shrunk a house. Shouldn't our spare Cerebus have grown an extra set of full-on horns by now? Focus more or less on the upgrades? Been born again against all odds, but further out asunder, left of center, maybe much better equipped? A certified index, right? Hun? Hun? Babe, sweetie? My sneaky self-same puppet? That you? No? Good. 'Cause I am moved to confess I ate the last of our money to produce this section of open-ended debate, but I invented punishment instead by accident. I'm sorry, hun. Want some? Stock. His father bought stock. His father's father also bought stock. He said, pretty soon you just start to pick things up. gobs, amongst gobs and gobs and gobs of sloppy spectral audience reaction shots. Tip: to document our results in real time, I drew a pack mule, then erased it. Gag: somebody puts somebody's money where somebody's mouth is supposed to be. Craft: an alien wish set adrift amidst cruel, cruel gibberish. The letter of the law lives long and prospers. Signed, in cursive on guest checks, geese formations dot the totals. Need be: I am not I, although I can be, also, if need be. Iffy: so close it almost isn't. Jesus Christ: got told off by the lead supervisor while wiping actual human excrement off the retro rainbow walkway entrance. Hark. Oh, the angels, of course, the angels that perch over the town in hunger, not shock, their mouths open wide, so wide they are almost all mouth. No one. The thing is, no one dead, no one dead ever gets a discount. A vow. Whoever you are, I am before the light of not what this world can afford, but built by what I say to you beyond all, made to order for the record, bored into the low prices of the gone world, bound now by contract to any echo, cool on heavy rotation. In the beginning, you thought of what you did or were doing as explicit enough, yet somehow willing to believe I was singing. The track is skipping, beyond myself and oh so very opposite whatever, landscape unraveling, claims I need to be, slowly reassembling. In due time, I do bring, I mean, will bring and am, beyond any calling, a certain kind of telling. I can bring beyond both myself and all, belief now existing, in several settings, in place of you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for talking about your work.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was amazing. Thank you, Toby, and thank you to all of our guests, and thank you for all of our audience members for showing up today. We do these every weekday at 1 p.m., so join us next week. On Monday at 1 p.m., we'll have a conversation between the New York City Public Advocate, Jimani Williams, with Brian Dories and Fong Bui. And I will let you all unmute your mics so that you can say goodbye as you leave. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Toby. Thank you, Anna, Olga, Sean, Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sholto and Emily. Zach, I really like
Leandro. Good luck, Olga. Good luck, Sean. Good luck, Anna. Good luck, Beau. Good luck, Peter.
I hope if anyone comes to New York, you write us.
My phone. Lydia. Good luck, Emily. Good luck, Teresa. Sholto. Get everybody here.